Resuming debate, the honourable member for Durham.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise in the House today to oppose Bill C-71, and I do so wanting to recognize the context that our country finds itself in right now. We have too high immigration levels. We are now approaching an average of 1.5 million people coming into the country per year. And the reason we know that's too high is because population growth is now outpacing the job market, it's outpacing the housing market, it's also outpacing investment in social services like hospitals, schools, and childcare facilities. The quality of life for the average Canadian is in decline because of the stress being placed on our local economies and on public services. And this is a sentiment held not just by people who may have been in Canada for many generations, but also by people who are immigrants themselves, children of immigrants, grandchildren of immigrants. So when we review Bill C-71, the ultimate question I think we need to ask ourselves is this a logical, reasonable, common sense approach to citizenship and immigration, or is this a continuation of an approach that has been in place for years now that is actually harming the quality of life for all people in the country, regardless of their backgrounds? To advance a common sense approach to immigration, I would put forward a three-part standard that we can evaluate Bill C-71 against. The first question that any person would ask is how many people? How many people would be entering the country under Bill C-71? It is a very reasonable question, one that I imagine any Canadian would ask, and would be imperative for the government advancing this legislation to have an answer to. Unfortunately, we have tried our best to get specific numbers from the Liberal government on this legislation, and we have not gotten that number. We do not know how many more people would be entering the country under Bill C-71. And given the existing constraints we have, that is a very important question for the people of Canada to have an answer to. The second part of this test, as my colleague from Calgary Heritage mentioned, would be criminal background checks. Any Canadian, whether you just got here or you've been here for a long time, would say it is common sense to do criminal background checks on who enters the country. It should be a no-brainer for anyone to agree to. And yet, we have been advocating for the provision of mandatory criminal background checks in Bill C-71 without the support from the Liberal government or their allies in the NDP and the Bloc Québécois. We are asking very clearly, why not do proper vetting before granting citizenship to people who do not live in this country and are only being granted citizenship through a weak and watered-down substantial connection test? So the question becomes, why would anyone be surprised by this? We have seen example after example of the Liberal government not prioritizing criminal background checks in existing immigration policy. We've seen examples just this summer of the Liberal government admitting into the country someone who's an alleged ISIS terrorist, granting that person citizenship while he plotted a terrorist attack on Toronto, the biggest city in the country. We've seen an example of this Liberal government granting a student visa in another incident to someone who planned a terrorist attack on New York City. It is on brand for the Liberal government to not be concerned about criminal background checks, and this is yet another instance of where Bill C-71 fails to meet a common sense standard for appropriate immigration and citizenship policy. And the last point I will make in terms of this standard is economic impact. We have asked for a mandatory, comprehensive economic impact assessment so that the Liberal government would share with the people of Canada what is the impact of admitting even more people, adding to population growth into the country. What would the impact be through Bill C-71 on our hospitals, on our schools, on our childcare facilities? What would the impact be on young Canadians who aspire to own a home and are pessimistic about whether that dream will ever come true because we are not building enough houses, but we are adding more people? What would happen to the job market, where we're seeing increases in employment, but especially youth employment? Would contributing more people to the country have a negative effect on our young people's ability to get a job and start their careers? This is what a common sense approach to immigration and citizenship would be seeking to answer. And yet with Bill C-71, we are very, very far from getting answers to these questions. Now, many people hearing my words today may have some questions of their own, which is, how did we get to this point? How did we get to a point where a liberal government can advance legislation that so clearly does not respond to the context that our country is living in? How did we get to a point where you can walk into the House of Commons and have legislation put in front of you that does not address the specific concerns that many Canadians of all backgrounds have about our current immigration levels? And that is fundamentally the result of what has been a concerted effort to stifle debate and criticism of immigration policy in this country. For a long time now, daring to ask a question about how immigration policy affects Canada, daring to criticize the liberal status quo on immigration, has gotten you smeared, labeled, name-called, fingers pointing in your face, people questioning whether you have compassion or concern for people of all sorts of different backgrounds and cultures. The reality is that they can finger point all they want. They can do all the name-calling they want. They can do all the smearing they like. The reality is that we have a very specific purpose when we enter this House of Commons, which is to ask the fundamental question of what is best for Canada. In order to apply that lens to Bill C-71, we would need those three critical pieces of information. Number one, how many people are entering the country? Number two, are there appropriate vetting mechanisms in place and background checks? And number three, what is the impact that increasing the population even further will have on our economy? By not answering these questions, I have a very hard time understanding how any member in this House can say that this legislation is complete and deserving of a vote. In my view, this has failed every single measure of a logical, reasonable, common sense immigration and citizenship standard, and that is why we must oppose it. Lastly, what I will say is this: whether it's immigration policy, housing, citizenship, whatever it might be, it is imperative that we put the Canadian people first. And I do believe that this is a window into how that is not being met. Every time we vote in here, every time we come in here and debate a matter of legislation or policy, we should have at the top of mind the Canadian taxpayer, the Canadian who voted for us to be here, to represent our local communities and represent our interests. The immigration status quo in this country is not doing what's best for Canada. And I believe with this legislation, we're seeing a very clear example of that. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. And this will be the second consecutive Conservative that has spoken in regards to the immigration system as a whole and tries to give glorification to Stephen Harper, who was a disaster on immigration. What they are glorifying is the fact that Stephen Harper, for example, cancelled the sponsoring of parents and grandparents. They literally deleted hundreds of thousands of people that were under the process of becoming permanent residents. You want to talk about cold immigration policies, go back to the Conservative years. What's important is the mixture of immigrants that are coming for permanent residence. We have annual targets that are set. That annual target is going to be coming out again. You will find, Madam Speaker, that there is a great benefit through immigration to Canada. The Conservatives of late are trying to give the impression that it's an us versus them. We should be proud of the diversity. Look at the immigration programs.
Sorry, I do have to allow for other questions. The Honourable Member for Durham.
Madam Speaker, this is exactly what I'm talking about. We have Canadians of all backgrounds concerned about the high immigration levels, the fact that population growth has outpaced jobs, housing, social services, and once again the Liberals go back to their old and tired playbook of trying to point fingers, smear, accuse you of not caring about people. I hear from my constituents all the time, constituents from all different racial, cultural, religious backgrounds, and they are concerned about the strain that population growth is having on our quality of life, and that is why it is important that we ask serious questions about Bill C-71. Thank you.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Vancouver East.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Speaker. What's become clear from the Conservative side is this. They're refusing to acknowledge that what Bill C-71 does is to restore the rights of Canadians that was taken away from them unconstitutionally 15 years ago by the Conservatives. That's what we're talking about. These are not immigrants. They are Canadians. They were deemed to be a lower class Canadians by the Conservatives. And then they keep saying that the NDP and the Liberals voted with them on Bill C-37 15 years ago. Do you know why, Madam Speaker? Because Stephen Harper, the Conservative at that time, put out an edict and said if the bill was not passed unanimously, it would mean that none of the war veterans, the war brides, would go to their graves without their citizenship, and that was wrong. So I wonder if the Conservatives will just take a moment to understand that history and understand by voting against Bill C-71, they're denying once again Canadians the right to citizenship unconstitutionally.
The honourable member for Durham.
Well, once again, you can make all the arguments you want in favor of Bill C-71, but why aren't any of our questions being answered? How many people? Where are the criminal background checks? And why can't we do an economic impact assessment? Put it forward as part of your legislation, but at least have the respect, have the decency to tell the Canadian people what impact their policies are going to have on our country and on our communities. At least respect the Canadian people enough to give them that information.
Order. I want to remind members if they have other questions, they should wait till the appropriate time. So questions and comments, we have time for a brief one. The honourable member for Vancouver East.
Speaker, that is an outrageous response because the member is talking about the very Canadians who's been denying their rights as though they're not Canadians. Madam Speaker, they're only not having their Canadian citizenship because of an unconstitutional law created by the Conservatives. Will the member actually recognize second-generation born abroad family members are in fact Canadians as it has been recognized by the courts?
That's right. Honourable member for Durham, a brief a brief answer.
Madam Speaker, I'm very happy to recognize that the NDP Liberals are advancing a watered-down and weak substantial connection test in Bill C-71, and that is how they're rationalizing the continued population growth in our country, despite the fact that Canadians of all backgrounds believe immigration levels are too high, the influx of people into Canada is too high, and it's putting a constraint on our economy and on our social services. Why don't they do what's best for Canada and stop being obsessed with making life harder for everyone in our country? Thank you.
Order. I just want to remind members again, if they have other questions and comments, to please wait till the appropriate time to do that.